I'm a really big fan of writers starting out and cutting their teeth on continuing drama, and I recognise these days it doesn't happen so automatically, and I think it's a real shame. And I think the difference is if you work on continuing drama, or indeed then you go on to work on somebody else's show as a guest writer, you learn how to apply your craft. You're not self-expressing, you're not telling your story in the way that only you can. You're actually having to conform to a format that exists and to write to characters that you didn't create and to actually inhabit that space as a professional writer. And it's astonishing how many writers out there that I've come across, and my husband and I had our own company for a while as well, so we were commissioning writers ourselves. And I think there are a lot of writers who, because they've only done that self-expression thing and they've kind of gone, I want to tell my story, which of course is legitimate and valid. But if you've only ever done that, you don't know how to ply your trade. You don't know how to be hired as a writer. You don't know how to fit into somebody else's show. And the bread and butter of writing is being a writer for hire and writing on other people's work. And it is an incredible discipline to learn and to evolve and to understand on any given show how many story strands, how many characters, how many A, B, C, D stories are there. There's so many very interesting things about the craft, and every time you are a guest writer on another show, you learn different things. And all of that adds to your writing muscle, so that when you write your own original material or your own adaptations, you bring all of that to bear. So I think it's a really crucial training ground. Shameless was a real game changer for me. But it was sort of off the back of a play that I'd written called Airsick, which was produced at the Bush Theatre. And so I was on continuing drama series, and I kind of reached a point where I felt like I just wanted to take a risk and just try and write something that I had no idea how to write. And because I'd worked in TV for quite a long time as a script editor and development exec before writing, I sort of wanted to smash to pieces all the form that I felt I knew. So I wrote a play entirely speculatively, and was really lucky that the Bush Theatre picked it up and produced it. And I think that was the first time people felt very excited about my voice and really felt like there was a sort of subversive black comedy character writing voice there. And so it was from that I got onto Shameless. And I think Shameless probably was the first time I was on somebody else's show, but where I felt my voice was completely attuned to what that format actually was. And yeah, I mean, Shameless was such an incredible show to be a part of, and we were able to take big risks. We were able to explore all sorts of things. Actually, frankly, now I don't think you'd be able to do, and you probably wouldn't get away with. But I think it put me on the map in a particular way as a writer with a strong voice. I mean, I remember when I was asked even to go and meet on Shameless, potentially, I remember my agent saying to me, okay, but they won't hire you. They only hire northern burly men, working class men. And I was like, okay, fine, I'm a short southern female. So, but because I think my voice was so right for the show, I wrote one episode and then very quickly became a lead writer on it. And then by series 3, I was the lead writer. And so I think it was quite a fast learning curve for me as well, of going through that process of being a guest writer essentially, and then actually having to help steer the ship and break the story moving forward. So I think there was a big evolution, but at the same time, I think I very quickly, as a writer, went into that place of being a lead writer, because a lot of those skills I'd learned from being a script editor and development exec map onto that. So the whole thing about breaking story and understanding how to generate that big amount of narrative and how to shape it into individual episodes. I've been doing that for a long time before I was actually a writer, and I think it's one of the things I love the most. And so it wasn't a difficult transition for me to get to that point. So The White Queen was initially a development with the BBC, and we talked about it being possibly half hours twice a week, maybe it was 1 hour. The format was sort of very fluid to start with. And then we landed on it being hour-long episodes, 10 episodes, this gigantic juggernaut, and it was going to be on BBC One on Sunday nights. Starz, which is an American network, came on board as a co-producer. Obviously, it was expensive, so that made sense. And it was challenging because I think what the UK terrestrial market wants and likes out of a drama, tonally and in terms of cast and the talent attached, is and can be quite different from what an American network wants. I think some American networks are better bedfellows with British broadcasters, and sometimes it's a bit of a collision. It was very difficult. Things like cast, I think there's very different taste and very different requirements for who the Americans think will work for their market versus who the British broadcasters want that feel right for a UK audience. So I think there were a lot of challenges with that. And I think the show itself had quite a different reception in the two countries. And I think for the UK, because it was more populist in its approach to period, and fast-paced, and it was based on a series of novels by a popular writer. And I think the UK, there was this sort of attitude of, well, if the BBC is going to do this big historical series about the Wars of the Roses, it should take it from real history and it should be very serious and it shouldn't be this sort of frivolous thing. So I think there was some there was some difficulty in the way it was received. In America, it did the thing that very few shows do, which was it grew its audience exponentially. And even episode 2, we had a much bigger audience even than episode 1. And the traditional thing is episode 2, your audience drops because everyone turns up to see what something is, and then all the people who don't like it go away. But in America, the audience just grew and grew and grew. And I think it was because there was just that expectation of what period drama is or should be didn't exist in America. And so in America, the show was nominated for Golden Globes and Emmys and actually spawned a whole genre, because after that, Starz, for many, many years, and lots of them with me, made these female-driven period dramas, and then lots of other networks followed suit. But I think for the UK, it was a more problematic show tonally compared to what people were used to as a period show. So the UK and the US have completely different structures for producing television, particularly television drama. And that was one of the things that was very evident when I worked on The White Queen. The American network expected me to be a showrunner, expected that the person who created the show would be the most senior executive producer on the show. And in the UK, the opposite is true. And the writer is, or at that point particularly, was very rarely even a producer, let alone someone with any seniority. And it's all non-writing producers who make all the creative decisions about how to realise the scripts and how to produce the show. So that inherent collision between the two cultures, TV producing hierarchies, was very exciting for me, because having already been the other side of the desk as a head of development and frankly pretty much producing by the time I quit that job, it had always been very hard for me to leave that at the door and just be a writer and feel like I wasn't allowed a voice in how my scripts were realised and not have any authority when I felt I had things to bring to the table that were useful and relevant. So because Starz were so supportive of my work and wanted to do further seasons with me of comparable shows, it made sense I wanted to go to LA really to learn more fully about show running, to augment what I already knew, and to make sure I was properly qualified to work in that system as an executive producer. So I was there for a few years. I was very lucky. I got onto the WGA showrunner training program, which totally filled all the gaps of things that I didn't know, so that I was able to properly inhabit the role of showrunner and senior executive producer. They're the same thing, just different words for it, on everything moving forward. And I think the big thing was knowing that that was the role I wanted, and knowing that I didn't want to be a writer who sat at home and just wrote and handed over scripts for other people to realise. And the only way then, and still now to a large extent, that a writer can inhabit that role is in America. So the term showrunner was first used in America because they wanted to be able to distinguish who was the executive producer who was actually in charge. Because TV and film, you end up with a lot of people. In TV, you would have so many EPs that literally the crew and HODs wouldn't know who was in charge. So the term showrunner was coined so everyone actually knew who was in charge. The easiest way to explain what it is first and foremost, a showrunner is a writer. They are the person who created the show, but they are also the most senior executive producer on that show. And the easiest way to think of it is it's like being the CEO of a company. So the show is a company and the showrunner is the CEO. The showrunner works with the network and the studio, so the network being whoever's going to air the show, the studio generally being whoever's going to pay for the show. But they are equals. They work together. They all have very different jobs, very different roles, but there is no hierarchy among that. Everyone just works together to make the show. In the UK, that is very, very different. So the person who would occupy the most senior creative role in the UK would be a non-writing executive producer. So it might be the person who owns and runs the production company, or it might be someone at a network, but it would never be the writer. What's happened more recently as the two countries have converged and as co-production has become the order of the day, and that's been for quite a long time now, is that the UK has imported a lot of American terminology, but it hasn't imported the actual practices and job roles, and it most certainly has not imported the different hierarchy of how television is made. So what's happening in the UK, and has been for quite a few years now, is that the term showrunner is being used here to mean head writer. It is being conflated with head writer. So when it's used in the UK, it confuses the Americans, because what they think is, oh, okay, that's the showrunner, that's the person who's in charge, that's the person I phone up. So the network and the studio expect to phone the person with the title showrunner because they think that person is literally in charge of the entire show, making every creative decision, hiring HODs, hiring directors, choosing cast, running their own team of writers without anybody else having input. And that isn't how it works in the UK. I struggle with why that is happening, because it feels unnecessary. There is nothing wrong with British terminology. There's nothing wrong with lead writer or head writer, because that accurately describes what the role is in the UK. So I think there's a lot of confusion caused about this importing of terminology. But I think also the problem is too that a lot of writers now think a lot of people get given the title executive producer and or showrunner. And the UK system doesn't bake into the process training. So in the American system, because you come up through a writer's room, you are trained of how to be a producer right from an early stage in your career, because you are sent to set to produce your own episode. It is all baked into the process of being a writer, because writers are producers. In the UK, writers are writers. We sit at home in our pyjamas and we just write scripts, and there is very little interface with the production process. So you don't train in how to be a producer, and most writers haven't got a clue about any aspect of production, whether physical production or how to creatively produce a show. And so I think there is a real difficulty that a lot of UK writers now hear the term showrunner, want that title executive producer, but they have nothing to bring to the table. And what they want is the money for it and the title, but literally they don't do the job because they don't know how to do the job and they're not qualified to do the job. And quite naturally that frustrates the people who really are doing the job of executive producer, and the people who really are on set from 5 a.m. in a muddy field, who understandably feel, why on earth should that writer have that title? They're not doing the job and they don't know how to do the job. Any writer in the UK who would like to also produce or be involved in producing their own work, I think what they have to accept is, on your own time and on your own money, train yourself. Figure out how to qualify yourself to be a producer. So when you have a show in production, obviously go to set. For the most part, the budget doesn't allow for the writer to be on set all the time, and you don't have a role. But if you want to be there shadowing and learning how a production works, pay for it yourself. Go to set, pay for your own hotel. That's what I did when I was working on The White Queen. I had 2 blocks I was there legitimately, but the 3rd block I wanted to see that director and I didn't need to be there. I paid my own transport and I paid my own hotel. That's what you have to do. You have to invest in yourself. So be around your own production as much as you can, but also take people out for lunch or coffee and pick their brains. It's not difficult to ask an editor, can I sit in and watch a cut for a few hours? Most people will be quite happy to do that. Ask a line producer, can you show me how you approach doing a budget? You know, what costs money, what doesn't cost money? And there are tons and tons of books out there. There are tons of the making of all these amazing shows. You can watch hours and hours and hours of behind the scenes footage of who did what on every single show, learn the language of it. And there are courses, there are so many resources. So if you put in the time to train yourself, it means that when you get to a place where a show of yours is greenlit and you want to be meaningfully involved as a producer, you can actually demonstrate to the people you'll be working with that you have something valuable to offer, that you have some skills, some training, and that you can actually be value added to the show and not just someone who's sort of hanging around being called a producer. An integral part of the American system is writers' rooms. And they're quite different to the way traditionally in the UK we write and evolve the scripts for a series. And in America it comes from the fact that their TV comes from Broadcast Network, which was always 22 episode juggernaut runs of these great big shows. And so you had to have this factory, this script factory that was just there, overseen by the lead writer, aka showrunner, who was essentially performing quality control and making sure that these episodes were all coming out that are the right sausages to make the show. In the UK, traditionally, we have had story conferences when we do have a group of writers gathering. A story conference is very different because story conferences would only be for a few days or a week, at most a couple of weeks. So the soaps, continuing drama, would always have story conferences. The difference is story conferences are run by non-writers. They are run by creative producers or script editors or development execs, and the writers contribute, but they contribute as sort of guest voices in the same way as they do on the show itself. They're not driving that. In a writer's room, in a proper American writer's room, there is no person in that room who is not a writer. And they're very strict about it. You're not even allowed in if you're not a writer. And in America, the writer's room is 100% driven by the showrunner. So the lead writer, the person who created the show, directs and drives and organises their writing team to generate the rest of the season. And they also absorb the role of script editor. So when there are notes that come from the studio or the network or anyone else involved in the production outside of the room, those notes come to the showrunner, and it's the showrunner who disseminates those notes to their writing staff, filters the notes, discusses the notes, works with those writers to get their scripts to the next draft. And ultimately the showrunner will quite often have those scripts pass through their own computer. They will overwrite those scripts if they're not right. So the fundamental difference is in America, it is 100% writer-driven and driven by the show creator. In the UK, it is driven by non-writing producers. I have worked in an American writer's room. I was on The Man in the High Castle, which was my first experience of being in a proper writer's room. It's quite a shock to the system the first time you do it, because British writers traditionally, it's changing now, there's a lot more mini rooms and other ways of working, but at the time we were all basically just still sitting at home in pyjamas writing on our own. So the idea of being in a room full of people with lots of voices and what if this and what if that is weird, because it's noisy. You sort of think, I can't hear myself think, and it feels like an odd process when you first begin. And I think there are various schools of thought about how efficient a story-breaking tool it actually is. And I think it is down to the skills of the showrunner, whether or not that room is efficient and effective, or whether it is just a cat fight of, just people talking and saying things and, can't hear yourself think. So I think the showrunner has to be incredibly focused and disciplined about what they want from each day and each section and each writer, and how they're planning on getting that show up on its feet in terms of the scripts. I have run writers' rooms for my own shows. Again, I think for me it was a much easier transition, because having been a script editor and development exec, breaking story was my first language. So the idea of being able to create a show and then oversee a group of writers to generate the rest of that season felt really second nature to me, and it feels such an organic thing to do. I love it. It's the part of the process that I probably love the most. I think the problem is partly of terminology, that we are adopting the words without the practices. But I think it's probably a slightly bigger, deeper problem than that, because co-production is necessary and has been necessary for pretty much a decade now. And I think there is just such an inherent collision between the two TV producing cultures that I think the Americans want a showrunner. They want the system that they are familiar with, because as far as they're concerned, a showrunner on TV is the equivalent of a director for a movie. It is unthinkable for them to make a TV drama without a showrunner. So they want an empowered creative in that role. And I think there is obviously a difficulty, because in the UK, because we don't have that role, I think there's been this fudge that's happened of sort of adopting the terminology while the same people are still in the position of creative authority. I think it's sort of a sop to co-producing. But I think obviously over time, writers can learn to be producers in the UK and can legitimately be showrunners, and there are quite a few of us and the numbers are growing. But there is a real difficulty, because if writers become executive producers and if writers become the driving force creatively of their show, the collateral damage is that a lot of creative producers are rendered extinct. I mean, they're not needed anymore. And that's such an existential threat to a lot of people in the industry that there is understandably a bit of a battle. There's a bit of a collision there, because writers being empowered mean producers being disempowered and becoming just logistics people.